Hi, everybody. You're listening to the Passionately Wrong podcast. Welcome. Today, Randy and I are going to talk to you about something we know very well, which is how thinking you're right doesn't mean you're right, and how being confident you're right sometimes leads you to actually worse outcomes. So we call this episode When Certainty Kills. And we found that there are some surprising overlaps between the business world and the military world. And we're going to explore some of those in the next little bit with you guys. What I want to start with is the idea that you need to be confident in order to be successful. You need to think that you're going to achieve your goals. But that very process, ironically, can make it less likely you'll achieve your goals because it affects the quality of your thinking. When you're pretty sure you're going to be successful, you then start to close your mind to competing ideas. You filter out suggestions and ideas and inputs from the real world that would have told you, hey, wait a minute, you're heading in the wrong direction. Things aren't looking so good. So the idea I think we're going to play around with and explore today is how to deal with this contradiction between knowing you're going to be successful or wanting to be successful, and at the same time needing to build a certain amount of doubt into your process, either before you start planning, during the process itself, or after you've completed your project.
Yeah, James. So I think that I think that the core of this theme, it kind of can go back to what we talked about in the last two episodes, which was communication. But in this case, it's not you communicating so much as you listening. And if you come in with your own certainty that you know the right way, you know everything. And I come at this from having had a lot of different leaders at a lot of different all my levels in the military. Because as an enlisted guy, I'm always having an officer in charge of me, if nothing else. I'm never the guy in charge. So pretty much my whole 32 years in the military, I had at least one person in charge of me, if not multiple. And in some cases, I would change leaders every 2 years. I would have the same job, but I would change my top two, my leader, my sub leader every 2 or 3 years. And I saw all kinds of different types of leadership. Some were very certain that they knew everything and they didn't really want any feedback from the people underneath them. None, zero. Like, hey, I know it, and your job is just to do what I say. And in a lot of cases, I saw how that affected the team, how it affected me, that this guy, I didn't feel like he knew everything. If we were going to do a job, I'm like, well, I've done this job like 5 times and he actually has never done it because I know his biography. So why does he think he knows better than me? And why wouldn't he listen to what I have to say? And that really just made me bitter. And I think it made almost everyone in the team bitter in a lot of cases. And then I saw the exact opposite, people who were not so certain, and they would say, kind of be buddy, and they're like, hey, what does everyone want to do? Let's take a vote. And that's not necessarily the best way to lead either. I think listening to see if anyone's got anything to add doesn't hurt. It usually doesn't take a lot of time. And there's crisis situations where you don't have that, you don't have that time, you don't have the freedom to do that. And I understand that. And every business is different. The military's life or death. A helicopter went down. Who wants to go? No, you get on the freaking helicopter. We're going to rescue those guys. I understand that sometimes there's emergencies and there's ways to prepare for that too. But really, I don't think it's too much to ask. For the most part, ask some input. Give the freedom of your team input, and if nothing else, to give them time to express themselves. And you're like, this is why I think my idea is better. And then let's move on. So that's kind of where I wanted to start with this.
Yeah, and I think it is really helpful to point out the benefit of good communication processes, and in this case, the benefit of listening. And you highlight the impact of a leader's style on the team members. And that's a really important reason why projects succeed or fail. The leader can set the direction, but they're not going to be doing all the work. So if they don't have the full buy-in of the team members, they're making it less likely that they're going to be successful. I like the idea of thinking about it from the perspective of the person making the decision and the people working on or implementing the project, and how a leader's certainty or openness to communicate or listen can impact both their effectiveness and the effectiveness of the team. I have to admit, I was more often in the position for most of my legal career to be making the final decision. I did have bosses, right? I had to report to the CEO. By the way, everyone who you think doesn't have a boss does have a boss. The CEO had to report to the board had to report to shareholders. It's always tempting to think that you're ultimately going to be the one making the decisions. But
Elon Musk.
Exactly. He's got to answer to bankers now, and either that or he goes bankrupt, I guess. He's shown more of that right at the top of the hierarchy than anyone else. One of the reasons I would sometimes be imperious in making decisions is partly because I thought I was right, yes. And there I demonstrated a closed-mindedness that I think hurt my effectiveness for sure. Also, it was just a little bit, the consequences weren't so severe, and it was just, we had to pick a way. I know this way would work. So yes, I might get some benefit from listening to you, but it costs me time and effort. So it's a bit of the idea that I want to make quick decisions and move on. But honestly, if I hear myself talk about it now, and if I think about it, those are just excuses. We always should try to make the best decision we could. And as soon as you start thinking that you're the only one who has the answer, you're running a pretty clear risk that you're harming your effectiveness, either because you don't have all the information or because you're demotivating your team. So it's a good thing to add.
I think this goes back to the why we decided to call this podcast Passionately Wrong, right? Are you so certain that no one has anything to add that you have the absolute right decision? I mean, I think most people would look in the mirror and say, there's some wiggle room there at the very least.
You can take almost anyone from Einstein to Fauci to every political leader. As good as they are, they're also sometimes wrong. And it is assuming that you're right that creates some of the problems we've been discussing. So I think what we'll do next, Randy, is talk about ways to avoid this trap. And I think we're going to talk about maybe at least 3: pre-mortems, post-mortems, and crisis management. Let me start with pre-mortems because I really like this idea. It is when you are planning a project and before you've started, taking a specific amount of time to say, all right, I think we've planned this as well as we possibly can. We've created the odds as much as we can in our favor. You nonetheless say, now assume it's 3 months down the road, the project was a massive failure. What are all the reasons why it went wrong? And then you just sit together with your team and you brainstorm and say, well, okay, unexpected competitor came in. There was a meteor strike. There was, more and less likely things, but you make as long a list as possible of all the reasons why you were unsuccessful. And then you take that list and say, aha, now knowing all of these things that we weren't thinking about before because we were focused on our success, now that we've brainstormed about our failure, can we, in the planning phase, before we've started, incorporate some new ideas to address potential and even likely failures?
Yeah, I mean, the military is great at planning. We have formats for everything. I think we have something called a 5-paragraph operations order, which we use pretty much interchangeably at all levels for anything. And we have some more detailed planning mechanisms too. But I think it would benefit, a company to have a standard planning, and you could improve on it, obviously, but you come up with this standard that covers all of the, pre-mortem possibilities and your plan. And therefore, and then as you experience problems later on, you can say, hey, let's add that to the pre-mortem, planning scenario so that we consider it next time. So having a plan is probably a big step. Having just a standardized plan that everyone goes to and everyone kind of, especially if you got people specialize, and you're like, okay, hey, accountant guy, we had these financial problems in the last 3 accounts. What's the pre-mortem plan to avoid these this time? And hey, logistics guy, blah, 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 same thing, so if you can assign these pre-mortem scenarios to specific sections, so that they become experts in solving these problems. And I think that goes to a big benefit, and that's what the military does. They divide it into sections, and they always say, "Hey, the weather guy, this is your problem. What are we doing when it snows? Hey, the blah blah blah." And so we designate these out to the specialties that can address those things and come up with solutions, ideally. And then I think the other thing that we do really good is we maybe overplan sometimes. We have what we call a PACE plan, which stands for PACE, stands for primary, alternate, contingency, emergency. I think they're just trying to think of, synonyms for contingency. So they just came up, but each one gets usually simpler because you have less time. I mean, if your primary town plan breaks down 3 days beforehand, obviously you have less time to implement the alternative plan. And if the alternative plan breaks down a day out, then you have less plan to implement the contingency plan. And then if the contingency plan breaks down like an hour beforehand, then you have your only thing you have left is the emergency plan. And that's like set your compass 100 degrees and run 5 miles until you hit, the river or something like that, So that's what we usually do. And you just got to kind of make a plan for failure and what you're going to do when that happens.
I love the idea of the PACE planning, Randy. I think in business, you're lucky if you have an alternative plan, a contingency plan. The idea of having multiple ones for increasing levels of severity is, on the one hand, kind of scary, actually, that you should need it, but actually based on, I'm sure, bitter experience, hard won. Most businesses, I believe, do have a pretty decent level of planning, but in my experience, it is all forward-looking and optimistic. It is a really great project plan for how to do things if everything goes well. The addition that we're trying to bring to the discussion is to suggest, and part of your planning needs to be things don't go well. There's a special subset of that, and you sort of touched on it, but I want to call it out, which is crisis management planning. So the pre-mortem is in aid of making your overall project plan better. So you think of this stuff and you adapt your plan before you even start it to say, all right, I'm going to make this plan as robust as I can because I've thought of a bunch of things and built right into my project plan. I'm not going to go that way because that's likely to create a failure. I'm going to go this other way. So that's the benefit of pre-mortem, is to make your pre-mortems, is to make your overall plan better. Crisis management and maybe contingency and emergency planning in the PACE model seems to be, or is, more oriented towards, you've done the best you could to get going. Now you're in the thick of it and things still went to hell. There's a significant benefit to, you're not hoping for it. You're not saying it's likely, but you're saying, if this thing comes up, I'm prepared to respond. And I'm prepared to respond. Those plans don't have to be very detailed, but what it does is it helps you avoid having to make decisions under stressful conditions.
Yeah. The idea is you have a plan that you can change, but at least you have a plan, right? And then yes, you can change it if you change it. So that's, military is a big believer in that. You know what? I want to add one thing to this about travel in today's world, because I think a lot of the listeners, especially from your side of the family, is the aisle, are going to be traveling internationally, and a lot of people, especially us, like people like us who've traveled around the world, we're very confident. We're like, yeah, I can do this. I can get off the plane, catch an Uber, blah blah blah. I can get to my hotel, whatever. But there's so much uncertainty and weird stuff going on in the world that this is a thing that the military does really well, right? And we used to have civilians from the government or from a nonprofit that were traveling with us, and like, you can't go with us. Like, we would pay for their mission, right? It's like, we're not going to pay for anything unless you do our contingency plan. And so they're like, oh, okay, what do I got to do? It's like, well, you need to, what's the phone number for the embassy? They're like, why do I need to know that? It's like, because when the country goes into revolution, where are you going to go? And he's like, oh, good point. What's the phone number to your hotel? What's the phone number? Where's the nearest police station to your hotel? And, all these things, these contingency plans for, I don't know if you remember was it 5 or 6 years ago, where a 5-star hotel was taken down in Africa. I can't remember the country anymore. But I mean, 6 terrorists took that thing and then started going to room, whacking people and just knocking on the door, let in, hey, room service, free gift or whatever. People would open the door, bang, go to the next door. And I read a book and I heard a podcast by this young lady. And the interesting thing is there was an off-duty British commando who had all his guns and armor in his trunk, and basically heard what was going on, put his stuff on there, and like James Bond went in there and whacked all the bad guys and saved everybody. And after a bunch of people had already died, before the police and everyone else could get organized. But the thing was, these people didn't have a plan. They didn't even know what room number the people they were traveling with were in. So they couldn't like call the other guy and say, what's going on? Where are you? Or get to the same room so we can defend together. So people just go to these places, and maybe I'm over militarizing the whole thing, but people go to foreign countries where they may or may not speak the language. They may or may not be familiar with any roads at all. And really, in most places, if you're going to a major airport, there's 1 or 2 major highways that go to the center where all the major hotels and embassies are. You can get there in 2 or 3 turns if you just look at a map. And just having a plan, for your international travel and a couple phone numbers is a lot better than being in your hotel room and someone knocking on your door like, what's that? So anyway, I just want to do a safety brief. Sorry.
No, it does fit the theme, right? Because when we travel, we assume everything is going to go okay. And so that's a form of certainty, saying, hey, it's always worked every time. I don't need to do any of this planning because, you just don't think of it. And that's a form of certainty. An unchallenged assumption is the kind of thing that we're trying to help people get past. I had, worked for many years for a Swiss headquartered company, and the Swiss are big planners. And it used to drive me crazy because our chairman would sit down and say, okay, I want to plan A, plan B, contingency 1A, contingency 1B. And it was clear we were never going to do more than one of them, right? So 80% of the work that we were doing to get ready for whatever it was, a meeting, a project, was going to be wasted. And our chairman was relentless about making us do this. And it wasn't until we had to use some of our contingency plans that I saw the beauty in the system, which was most of the time your effort will be wasted, but the times you need it, you are really, really, really happy you did the planning. And it's like that with your international travel. God forbid you're ever in a situation where you really need to call upon your emergency number, your emergency backup. But that's the point. The point is it's a relatively small effort in hindsight for the benefit that you get out of doing it. So I get it.
And
I think it's good advice.
it would really suck if you're like stuck in the military and was like, man, I listened to that podcast and he told me to do this and I didn't do it. One last story. When I was 10 years old, I lived in Iran in 1978, right while the revolution was going on with Khomeini and the Shah. And Ross Perot, my dad worked for Ross Perot. Many people may not know him. Ross Perot is a big supporter of the military. He's a self-made billionaire, and he owned a lot of companies. And one of the companies was the one my dad worked, a computer company. And he hired a lot of ex-military. So when the revolution hadn't occurred yet, but for 6 months prior to the revolution, there were blackouts, there were curfews, there was tanks running down the roads in front of our house. There was machine gun fire in the middle of the night. And so the military leaders who were all ex-military, they made a contingency plan. They said, okay, everyone practice driving to the airport and find 4 routes that are significantly different in case some of them are blocked or the roads are blocked by tanks or whatever. And everyone know those routes backwards and forwards and practice them every week. Everyone have a bag packed with, 2 sets of clothes, some water, blah, blah, blah. And they made all these plans just like the military did. And then one day the 2 senior executives got arrested, and they called Ross Perot and they said, hey, these guys are in jail. And he's like, that's it. Everyone headed to the airport. And, everyone grabbed their bags, went to the airport. and the airport, there's no flights out because everyone was trying to leave. The revolution was going to happen the next day, I think. And Ross Perot ended up buying that was his contingency plan. He bought a 747 and flew it in from Turkey to get us all out. So that's a good contingency plan too, if you got the money.
It's a good story. While you were in Iran in 1978, I was with my family in Saudi Arabia, and that put us, my parents, looking back, I'm amazed at the places they brought us to and the things that we did. We lived what I thought was a normal life, but we traveled to all sorts of interesting, strange, and dangerous places. My parents were in Afghanistan shortly before, things really descended into a bad spot there. And we traveled through airports in, Pakistan, all over the place. And it was only hearing my parents tell stories later that I saw that they did have contingency plans. Here's how we're going to get through customs. Here's what we're going to do if we get separated. And it instilled in me my own desire to, even when it's not such a dangerous environment, I'm traveling to Paris with my family. Well, I still talk about with my wife and my kids before we go, here's what we're going to do if we get separated at the metro stop. We're going to meet at the next one, or make sure that the kids have the hotel address so that if everything else fails and their phone isn't working, we're going to be able to meet up at some later point. So there's this level of easy contingency planning in a couple of layers that even in what you consider to be a very safe situation, maybe it's just our mindset, Randy, maybe it's the places we grew up. Maybe it's,
I think it's a generational thing. We come from a generation of low tech. I mean, not the lowest tech, but a lot lower than now, right? Where we didn't have cell phones. So even if you and I wanted to meet, on a weekend to go to a movie, we're like, okay, I'll meet you at the train station. And then if not there, if I'm late, then I'll meet you in front of the theater. And then if you already go to if the movie already starts, I'll just buy a ticket. And then I'll, once you sit in the back left side of the theater, I don't know if you ever did that, but I remember making these plans a long time ago. But of course, no one does that. They're just like cell phone text. And the whole generational thing it goes back to communication, right? So the current generation, they don't make a lot of contingency plans for meetings because they're like, everyone could just call you on the cell phone or text you, because everyone prefers to text now for some reason. But we had to make those plans. And so we're more accustomed to making these plans without the use of technology. On the other hand, the reason you should communicate with these younger generation is because they have probably used tech that we have never heard of, or an app that we haven't heard of that'll make our life easier that you could apply to your plan and make it a better plan. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff coming out every day that I don't pay attention to, that I know my son's like, hey, did you check out this new app? I was like, oh man, and I use that app every day now. So I think that's super useful.
Yeah. And, to the extent that we could even play devil's advocate for a moment and say, what, technology has advanced to the level that the kind of analog contingency planning you and I are talking about really isn't as necessary as it once was. You get an app on your phone that'll alert authorities to your presence, whether or not you've run out of batteries, whether or not you've turned it on, whether or not you've even thought about. I'm going to answer my own question by saying I think there's a benefit to at least thinking through, and it's the mindset more than the specific method. It's the thinking through for the specific tool that you use. What could go wrong? And if this thing goes wrong, have I got at least some thought process as to how I'm going to get past that problem? And that's more what we're recommending here is don't only be focused on everything going right all the time, focus on what might go wrong, and then use whatever tools are at your disposal, whether you're a member of the analog generation like us or the tech generation like our kids. There are some good tools that you will bring to bear to then put yourself in a better odds of successfully navigating. Should Brittany Griner have known that situation was deteriorating with Russia and maybe she shouldn't be so confident bringing in her vape product? I think that's asking too much, but it's not. I mean, whenever we traveled to a place that didn't have the same standards as Switzerland, let's say, which is pretty much the rest of the world, we did ask ourselves the question, can I bring my device in here, or do I have to bring a loaner device? Can I behave exactly the same way in country as I would when I'm home again? Not to stick on the travel example, but a little bit of forethought about what could go wrong goes a long way.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, we talked about pre-mortem, but I think at least from the military standpoint, post-mortem planning has always been a big thing in the military. We called it the AAR, the after action review. And we would do it after everything. We would do it after every mission. We would do it after every, training. And the leader would bring everybody in and say, okay, he would take a big butcher block, because we didn't have whiteboards back then. But when we started getting whiteboards, it was easier because we did the whiteboard. Take a butcher block, new fresh page, put a plus on one side, a minus on the other, a line down the middle, and go around the room. Give me 1 plus, 1 minus. And everyone in the room participated. And some of the pluses and minuses were weaker than others, but eventually you had a top 10 that made a difference. And it's like, this is what we did really well. This is what we did really poorly. How can we make the poor better? How can we keep the ones that worked? Because we've never done it that way before. And that was an interesting innovation you brought to it. And then we went forward and we did it better. And I'd always tell this story. There's this biography I wrote about this pilot from Vietnam, and he had like 270 missions in 1 year in Vietnam. They have 2 tanks, fuel tanks, a small one and a large one, and they always fight, land, and take off with the big one, because they don't, while they're doing these complicated maneuvers, they don't have time to watch the gauge. And then the small one, once they take off and they're flying to their objective, they flip it, and they use the small one to go just on those little jaunts, so they can save the big fuel tank for the fight in case it goes long, because it's a huge tank. And they can go for a couple hours. Well, on his first mission, he forgot to flip the tanks, and he freaking got there. They did the whole fight. They were there for a couple hours. They're flying back, and they're flying back in a finger formation, is what he calls it. We got a 1, 2, 3, and then the fourth one, he was the last one because he was brand new. It was his very first mission, and he was in the back on a kind of a wedge formation. And they're like halfway back, and his engine just stops, and he's like, and he's gone. They didn't even notice because he was in the back, right? And he thought they didn't notice. And then he's flicking levers, and he's trying to maintain because they're going about 250, 300 miles an hour, and he's flicking levers. He finally gets the other one primed, and he gets the other engine working, and he pulls up next to him like nothing happened, and no one said anything to him on the radio at all. And they all land, and they always did AARs. He said that AARs was the lifeblood of learning from everything. Everyone would just put their guts on the table. Whatever you did wrong, just say it so that we all learn from it. We're in war. People are shooting at us. Let's figure it out and make it better. So the leaders, like, I did this, I came in this, I dropped this napalm, I did this bomb. Everything went perfect. I didn't see any civilians. I saw everyone else. Everyone seemed to be going good. What do you got? 2 is like, I did this. 3, I did this. It looked great. They even complimented Tom, the number 4 guy. He's like, yeah, you did good for your first time. You got that bomb right on that mortar. The mortars, it was a good job. And then it's like, Tom, what did you see? And Tom's like, he thought they didn't know because they never said anything. So he's just like, well, I have a confession to make. And then the whole room just started laughing. And they're like, yeah, we know you didn't switch the tanks. Everyone's done it once. But he said, man, the lifeblood of that was just telling everything and putting it on the table so we could learn from our mistakes.
I like that story a lot, and it illustrates 2 important principles. I guess because the stakes are so high, and maybe because of the episodic or periodic nature of the stuff that the military does, you have super active times and then some downtime. For whatever reason, the rigorous habit of conducting after action reviews is a really helpful one, because you do learn stuff. You do absolutely see what went well, what didn't go well. It seems to me in the business world that the practice is far less common, because mostly people are busy. They've got 15 things going on at any given point in time. You finish one project, it's not like you get time to sit down, go have a cup of coffee, eat a donut, and talk about it at all leisure. I'm exaggerating a little bit what happens in the military. But the point is, you just go on to the next thing. You're busy, and therefore it's easy to skip the post-mortem or the AAR. And even when you do it, the reason your friend was successful, I suspect, is because he actually did admit, even when he thought no one knew. And that's hard to do. It's hard to admit you've made a mistake. But the point is that you don't have to be perfect at any given point in time to get better. You just have to acknowledge, hey, what's working, what's not working, how can we do it better next time? I think of that as continuous improvement. We've talked about it before. I'm certainly going to talk about it again because I think it's one of the most effective tools that a person can bring to any endeavor. Pay attention to what you're doing and try to make it better the next time you do it. So, if you're doing a podcast, make sure you press the record button before you start the show, for example. Or we talked at the beginning about just having a planning process for businesses. And I think a lot of businesses do have a planning process. Here's how you plan a new project. But guess what? How many of them regularly review the planning process itself and say, all right, we're going to add a pre-mortem in, we're going to add a post-mortem in, and tweak their process to make it better each time. So the idea of doing this sort of periodically, you take a step back and you review and ask yourself how you're going to make this thing better is part of the way that you get past this trap of certainty.
I just wanted to let you know, if I ever forgot to push record, I wouldn't tell you. I would just, when in the editing process, I would say the internet was really bad. We have to do it again. But I wanted to add that there's a SEAL, Jocko. What's his last name? Jocko Willink. Willink. He looks like Thanos, and he wrote a book called Extreme Ownership. And it's a 10 or 12 chapters. Each chapter is about a failure he did in either combat or buds, what he learned from that failure and how you can apply that to the business world. And the reason it's called Extreme Ownership is it's taking ownership of your mistakes, being able to extract the lessons and make the next iteration better so that you're more successful in your company or in war, in his case. And so it's actually a pretty interesting book. And he's made a whole business of advising CEOs and Fortune 500 businesses on how to accept responsibility for their failures and learn from them.
When you talked about relationships with leaders and the communication process, one thing I noticed was even at a fairly senior level where the expectations are high, the expectation is almost never perfect, that you will never make a mistake. It's how you respond to your mistakes that builds or destroys your reputation. So I can think of a few times where, I made stupid mistakes in my career. And the temptation to be defensive, to, deny it or hide it or, not accept the criticism is really strong. And I tried that way a few times until I realized that didn't work at all. When the chairman's yelling at you for something you legitimately messed up, the far better response is to listen, to honestly accept the criticism if it's correct, and to say, hey, I hear what you're saying. I'm going to learn from this mistake. That's the point. I'm going to learn from this, and it's not going to happen again. So in a way, learning to embrace that you're not perfect, because you're not, let me tell you, and then learning to turn that to your advantage by the relationship that you build with your colleagues. By the way, your subordinates also know you're not perfect. So when you acknowledge it with them, that also helps build credibility if you're showing that you care about getting better. So it's that attitude to want to improve that turns a mistake into, what did he call it? Extreme ownership. I really like that concept.
Yeah.
All right. So have we covered everything that we wanted to talk about on this topic, Randy?
I think so. I can't
Then,
think of anything else. Nothing else comes to mind. There's the concept of stubbornly defending your position against all reason, which we had talked about earlier, and that. I think we've attacked that in a couple different ways. One by don't be afraid to communicate and listen for input, just because everyone has their different experiences and they can always bring a little bit something to the table. I'll tell you the truth. At one point, I had the best idea every time. My daughter used to say, why are you always right? And I was like, I've been around for a while, so I am probably right 95% of the time in any conversations we're going to have, which means if you do what I say, you'll be right 50% more of the time than you are. So you should just do everything I say. And of course that didn't work, but you know, because of, I was put in a leadership position because I had the experience, because I had the knowledge, because I had the training. So of course I'm going to probably have better ideas than most of the people under me. That's why I'm the leader. But that doesn't mean that the ideas I have can't be made better, or that they can't come up with a better idea. It didn't happen very often, but once in a while it did. And I'm glad I asked. So I think the moral of this whole episode is, it goes back to what we started with, you know, listening and not being afraid to, you know, accept that other people may know something you don't know, or may be able to add something that you hadn't thought of.
I'm going to add to that with my own tool and tip for people as to how to get past the problem of that come with being too certain you're right. And something that we didn't mention and that I'll add is that the psychological risk that you fall into when you are too sure you're right is cognitive dissonance. And that really harms your thinking. You assume you're right, and therefore you interpret the world then differently. You don't seek out information that would contradict your views. You don't get any more new information that would inform your views. So the easy trick that I learned, it's easy to say now, it took me probably 20 years to learn it, is that just because you've been right 95% of the time and think you're right this time, it's still extremely helpful to add a couple of words at the end of your assertion. You say, I think this is the way to go, but I could be wrong. Those 5 words, but I could be wrong, don't always free you from cognitive dissonance. I saw you counting them. I had to count them too, but I did it in my head. You jarhead.
That's a Marine.
Sorry, I don't know the right slang term for whatever it is that I should use for you. You'll help me with that next time. No, but saying, I'm just admitting I was wrong and I could be wrong. And that helps. That helps you avoid that you fall into cognitive dissonance. So even if you think you're right, just in your head, and you don't have to say it out loud, but in your head, adding those words, but I could be wrong, helps people interact better with you, helps you come up with better ideas. So that's my parting advice.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and you know, listen to us next time. We'll have another interesting topic, I'm sure.
Bye, everyone.
We'd love to hear what you think, so please comment on the show with your thoughts. We read all of your comments.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks for subscribing. See you next time.